Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Congratulations on finding your way here, first of all. And let me welcome you on behalf of Christians in Science. This is one of a series of termly lectures by Christians who work in science. Let me introduce the speaker for tonight. It's Colin Humphreys, who'll be talking to us in just a moment. He's Professor of Materials Science here in Cambridge and has been since 1990. Had a very distinguished career, but I'll just tell you about two of the things that his research group has done, both very practical. One was he invented metal with a memory, so that if you sat on your glasses and bent them, they would bend back again afterwards. I think that's a really useful invention for some of us. The other thing that his research group has been working on is coloured light-emitting diodes with more useful colours than just red. And he tells me that if you changed all the traffic lights in Britain to use these instead of normal bulbs, you could close down 2 complete power stations. So again, a very useful thing to have invented, I think. But interestingly, one of his interests over the years has been in looking at the Bible and seeing how you can date some of the events in there and how he can bring his scientific expertise to bear on some of the events in the Bible. And in 1983, I think it was, he published a paper on the Star of Bethlehem, which was dating the birth of Jesus, in the journal Nature, which is the premier scientific journal, as many of you will know. And he tells me that that has actually been cited and quoted more than any of his scientific papers. Is that still true? Yeah, well, that's how it should be. And he subsequently worked on similar work on the date of the crucifixion, and recently has been looking into the miracles of Exodus, and he's published a very good book on that, which I was going to say is a very good book to keep on your bedside table. But actually it's not, because I kept it on mine and it was so gripping that it kept me awake half the night and I finished it. Anyway, without further ado, as you'll see, he's very well qualified to speak to us tonight on miracles and how a scientist should look at those. So, Colin, let me hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your very generous introduction. In fact, too generous introduction, because I actually didn't invent the things you said, but I've worked on them, so it's very kind. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk on this challenging topic which I was given. It reminds me that some years ago, I was not that many years ago, I was at Heathrow Airport in a thunderstorm, so we had to wait before boarding the plane. And we got on the plane, and I went to my seat, and then a white man came walking down the aisle wearing a dog collar. And for those of you who are from overseas, this is a mark of a clergyman. It's a special sort of collar. And he sat down beside me, and it was still pouring in with rain outside the aircraft, outside the plane. And he said to me, "Dreadful weather, isn't it?" So I nodded at the truth of this remark, and then we took off, and the plane climbed through these black clouds to start with, and then white clouds until we're above the clouds, and the sun was shining down on these cotton wool-like clouds below. And he leant over to me again, and he said, "There now, it's turned out to be a wonderful day after all." And he added, "Isn't that a miracle?" So we're going to talk about miracles. I have chosen to talk about 3 miracles, which in a sense are representative miracles in different ways. The first one, Moses obtaining water from a rock, where Moses struck a rock with his staff and water came out and the thirsty Israelites could drink it. And in a sense, this is a sort of minor miracle, because the Bible doesn't make very much of it. It's just presented and then not really mentioned again. That's an Old Testament miracle, of course. Another Old Testament miracle, the crossing of the Jordan, where the Israelites are faced with the Jordan flowing in flood and rushing down, and it's separating them from their promised land. And then suddenly the Jordan stops, and the Israelites are able to walk across the riverbed. And this is depicted as a more major miracle. So this is a major Old Testament miracle. And then comes the New Testament, the resurrection, which I guess is the greatest New Testament miracle. So these are 3 different types of miracles, which in a sense are representative miracles. And before I talk about those, let's have a quick definition of a miracle. And the top one is deliberately a popular definition. So I went to the web, and this I think is what most people believe. It's from a Dutch encyclopedia, I think, called Wikipedia, and it says, "A miracle can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being. And that is probably not a bad popular definition of a miracle, the sort of definition that a man in the street would believe in. If you go to the Concise Oxford Dictionary, then the definition of a miracle there is a marvellous event due to some supernatural agency. So this is a somewhat broader definition than this, because this can be a violation of natural law or not a violation of natural law. And I expect that most of us will have our ideas of miracles, but this one is probably the idea which, broadly speaking, most of us would agree with. So what do we mean, first of all, by natural law, which most people, the typical man in the street, believes is broken when a miracle occurs? This is just a simple idea of natural law. It's just what happens in nature, particularly something which happens regularly in nature. This people think of as natural law. So, example, we know the sun rises in the east every morning and it sets in the west every evening. And that happens regularly, and that's a sort of natural law. And we'd be astonished, quite rightly, if this didn't happen. At a deeper level than natural law is physical law. And this is a sort of definition of physical law I rather like. It's from a book by the famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist and also rather good bongo drums player, Richard Feynman, who wrote a book called The Character of Physical Law. So this book's all about physical law. And he says there is a rhythm and a pattern between the phenomena of nature which is not apparent to the eye, but only to the eye of analysis. And it is these rhythms and patterns that we call physical laws. And these physical laws are really more fundamental than what we call natural law. And if we go back to the previous example I gave, that in natural law we see the sun rise in the east every morning and set in the west every evening, then that leads us to believe that the sun goes round the earth. And of course men and women believe this for thousands of years. But then the eye of analysis of Copernicus came along and he said, no, actually the earth goes round the sun. And so physical law is more fundamental than natural law and also predicts some astonishing things. I'll just tell you a small diversionary story that when I was in Oxford, there was on the front page of the Times a scientific discovery which said the omega minus particle has been discovered by scientists in CERN. And so later that day I met a theoretical particle physicist and I said to him, just how significant is this discovery of the omega minus particle? And he said, it is an important discovery in a sense. He said, but really it would have been much more important if they hadn't discovered it. Because the symmetry of the known elementary particles was such that theoreticians were convinced this particle must exist from symmetry considerations. And that's the sort of thing which Feynman's talking about. He says there's this rhythm and pattern in nature, which is quite remarkable, which the eye of analysis can reveal. And the problem I think that scientists have with miracles is a particular problem. It's not that natural law is being broken, not just that, but that physical law is being broken as well. And physical laws are built up over many years. So they normally start with theories, and then a physical law is a theory which has survived many tests. So it's very well established, and I think this is the problem that many scientists have, more than many people who are not scientists, in believing in miracles, because they appear to break really well-established physical laws, and for which there's a huge body of scientific evidence. And here's a quotation from the professor in the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, who many will know as Richard Dawkins, and this is from an article he wrote called Snake Oil and Holy Water, published in Forbes magazine in October 4, 1999, and he says the resurrection, even the Old Testament miracles, are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. He has a wonderful style of writing, Richard Dawkins. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. And this is really the crunch point for Richard Dawkins and for a lot of scientists, that miracles are a violation of the normal running of the natural world, which scientists discover and then call physical laws. Well, let's see if this last statement in particular is correct, and let's go on to look at the miracle in the Old Testament of water from a rock. And it's described very simply in 2 verses in the Old Testament book of Exodus. The Lord answered Moses, "Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Well, I wonder what you think about that short description, and I think it's not referred to again. So in that sense, is a minor miracle. Just a couple of points. Strike the rock. The Hebrew word there used, I'm told, is for a rather fierce strike, if you like. The King James Bible translates this as smite the rock. So the picture you have to have in your mind is that Moses has his staff and he gives this rock a good thump. The other point which is interesting is the rock at Horeb suggests it's a large rock, right? Not a small rock, but a large and maybe well-known rock. So that's the story. And of course, it raises the question: can rocks give out water? And to us living in the UK, our immediate reaction is that this is an impossibility. Well, let's just think scientifically about it. For a rock to give out water, then it has to be able to store water, and it has to be porous. And there are porous rocks. There are sandstone and limestone rocks, and some others which are porous, and they can absorb huge quantities of water. And in fact, when they're underground, we use them as aquifers. They're just natural reservoirs of water, and we put wells into them and boreholes into them and extract the water. When I was at Liverpool University before coming here, and I lived in a place called West Kirby, and I had a house on a hill, and this was a sandstone hill. And I had a back garden which was steeply rising, and there was a cliff of sandstone which had been cut through by Victorians before, and this was about 10 or 12 feet high. And hours after a rainstorm, water would come pouring out of this rock. So the water had been absorbed in the hill, gone into the rock, and then flowed out in my garden. So water can be stored in these porous rocks. But in England, it's not kept in. It flows out. But if you go to a desert region, then rocks weather in a desert region in a rather different way from in England. And this is because of sandstorms which, at high speed, blow the sand onto the rocks, and they also blow organic matter from decaying plants and animals, and they're swept against the rocks at high speed. And over time, rocks in the desert can develop a hard, impervious crust, a bit like cement, and this is due to weathering. And if a crust of a porous rock is broken by a sharp blow, then water can indeed flow out. And this is an effect which is well known to hydrogeologists. And Bob has mentioned my book, so I will read out. It's an interesting account. This is from the British governor of Sinai, so we're looking in the right sort of area, who was called Major Jarvis, and he wrote a book published in 1936 called Yesterday and Today in Sinai. And he says, "The striking of the rock at Rephidim by Moses and the gushing forth of water sounds like a veritable miracle. But the writer, in brackets Major Jarvis, has actually seen it happen. Some of the Sinai Camel Corps had halted in a wadi, that's a dried-up river stream, and were digging in the loose gravel accumulated at one of the rocky sides to obtain water that was slowly trickling down through the limestone rock." So here's the water sort of coming out through the rock. "The men were working slowly, and the colour sergeant said, 'Give it to me,' and seizing a shovel from one of the men, he began to dig with great vigour. One of his lusty blows hit the rock, when the polished hard face that forms on weathered limestone cracked and fell away, exposing the soft porous rock beneath, and out of the porous rock came a great gush of clear water. It is regrettable that these Sudanese Camel Corps hailed their non-commissioned officer with shouts of 'What ho, the Prophet Moses.'" So you see that when you look at this scientifically, this is not an impossibility, and it has happened. And to bring you right up to date, I happen to be searching around, and I found this Associated Press report dated Wednesday, 25 February 2004. So this really is up to date, and it's about NASA rover drills Martian rock for water. The six-wheeled rover used a rock abrasion tool on its instrument-tipped arm to grind a fraction of an inch into the surface of rock called El Capitan. It's a wonderful title the Americans give these rocks, Spanish for captain. The rock's weathered surface, you see, so on Mars, sandstorms on Mars, right? The rock's weathered surface was ground away, don't have to do very much, a fraction of an inch, so that the rover could examine the material underneath. So here we have the Bible describing Moses giving the rock a hard blow, and a blow which no doubt will be sufficient to crack it. The rock at Horeb is a strange statement to make, because if you go to the traditional Mount Sinai, or to any others of the sites which have been proposed by Mount Sinai, you'll find there are many rocks there, mountains and rocks there. So this does suggest a large, well-known rock, and perhaps I can just say, as an aside, my own site for Mount Sinai has the mountain standing on what happens to be a large sandstone table mountain called Tadro, it's actually in Saudi Arabia, which has a diameter of 6 miles. I think it may be the biggest table mountain in the world. It's bigger than the one, the famous one in Cape Town. So just think of a large sandstone mountain with a diameter of 6 miles. The water storage capacity of that mountain would be huge. And I suspect that is the rock at Horeb, if my location of Mount Sinai is correct. So, was this a miracle? What we have seen is that water from a rock violates no natural laws. I mean, we may think it does in this country. It doesn't in the desert regions. The story fits what we know from science. If the story had said, if it had been made up, Moses could have commanded the rock to give forth water. He didn't do that. He struck it to break the crust. And the inference, again, is of a large rock, hence much water. It could be lucky timing, of course, or it could be a miracle of timing with God working in, with, and through nature. And I think from an isolated chance event like this, if you're a scientist and you look at the evidence and you say God might exist, then you can't tell, right? You can't really say, is this just a lucky event? Because we know that lucky events happen in life. Or is it a miracle of timing with God working through nature? But we'll come back to that later on. Let us move now to another miracle, which is a more detailed miracle, and that is crossing the River Jordan. And this is described in another 2 verses in the Bible, but 2 quite long verses. And this is in a different Old Testament book, the book of Joshua. And it's a very clear description, and simple description, and vivid description. Now, the Jordan is in flood all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, was cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Let's try and picture what the author is trying to describe. He's saying that the River Jordan is not flowing normally, it's in fact in flood. So it's much worse than normal, much wider and raging torrent, much more than normal. The Israelites are on one side, they're on the west of the Jordan, right, they're on the east of the Jordan. They want to be on the other side, the west of the Jordan, their promised land of Canaan. They've waited about 40 years for this. Tantalizing, they can see the promised land, but the situation looks hopeless because they're separated from it by this raging river. Then suddenly, the water stops flowing, and it's as if someone has turned off a giant tap and just cut off the water supply. And the Israelites cross the riverbed in triumph. Well, I wonder what you think of that story, and I'm sure many of you think, what a wonderful children's story, what a fabulous fairy tale. And that's it's a very realistic reaction, because that's certainly a possibility. But we should also ask, can the story be true? And can we know what happened 3,000 years ago? So I'm not going to ask people to vote on this, because it'd be embarrassing. But the fact is, as we all know, that most people, including most biblical scholars, believe this story, this remarkable story, to be a legend. when I read this story, I was struck by a curious detail in it. And all of you will know that in good detective stories, this is the stories where it's hard to know the answer, it's the minor clues that hold the key. The major clues provide the framework for the story. And if the major clues could solve the mystery, then the mystery would be easily solved. So it's the minor clues which are important. And there's a curious detail, a minor clue, in this story of crossing the River Jordan, which I found rather fascinating and extraordinary. Let's put it up again. And this, to me, was a minor clue. If I'd been inventing this story, or if most people had been inventing the story, I would have said, the Israelites came, they stood by the water's edge, and the river stopped where they were. But the story doesn't say that. It says it piled up in a heap a great distance away. So that's very odd, I think. Not only that, it goes on to say where it stopped, a place called Adam, and then in case you don't know where Adam is, it says in the vicinity of Zarethan. So, the writer's emphasising that the water actually didn't stop where they were, but a great distance away. And if you're going to make up a story, that's an extraordinary detail, and an unlikely detail to put in a made-up story. So, the water stopped flowing not at a town called Alice, but at a town called Adam. And if you're a scientist, if you're probably not a scientist as well, the obvious question to ask then is, why? What stopped the water flowing at Adam? And can we tell 3,000 years later? Well, to find that out, we first of all look at the geography. We start by looking at the geography of the Jordan crossing. And another point which struck me was the careful attention the author gives to the geography. So when the writer says that the Israelites crossed the Jordan, he doesn't just say they crossed the Jordan, he says it was opposite Jericho. He doesn't just say the water stopped flowing a great distance away, he says at Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan. And then, just for good measure, he said all these places are upstream from the Dead Sea, and the writer is clearly trying to root in history and in geography for his readers where these events happened. And the problem we face today is that most of the place names in the Exodus story have just disappeared. They have changed. And that, of course, is not surprising because it happened so long ago. So if you look at a modern map of either Israel or the state of Jordan on the other side of the River Jordan, you will find no town called Adam on a modern map. That's not quite right. I'll qualify that later. But you look at most maps, you'll find no town called Adam. And it's not surprising. We all know that maybe 10 years ago, there was a place in India called Bombay, and it's now called Mumbai, right? So these names change all the time. Ancient Hebrew texts, the original Hebrew written texts, only consisted of consonants. Other ancient languages, a number of others were like this. When the consonants were read, vowels had to be inserted so you could read them. And we're going back to that, of course, today. Those of you who use text messages in mobile phones will know that if you want to write text in a text message on a mobile phone, you write TXT. And the reader knows, from the context and from experience, you pronounce that text, not tixt or toxt or taxt, so it's text. The original Hebrew text, Adam, were the consonants DM with this apostrophe-looking sound, which is a breathing sound in front of it, a bit like ha. And that's how Adam was written. So it had these consonants. And when modern Arabic words have replaced ancient Hebrew words, there are patterns which are used. And people who study these languages are familiar with these patterns. And the key thing is to concentrate on this consonantal root. And if the Hebrew word began with this breathing sound, then in Arabic that's usually dropped, and an Arabic ending is added. So if you want to look for not only the name Adam, but actually any other ancient name, and try and find it on a modern map, then you concentrate on the consonants and look to see if there is a place with the consonant DM. And if you look at modern maps, you'll find higher up on the River Jordan from Jericho, there's a place called Damia. So you see the consonants DM are the same. It's got an Arabic ending, and many scholars agree Adam is Damia. In fact, most scholars agree with that. But can we prove that? And I should just mention, I said no modern map had this. There is one modern map. It's the Bartholomew World Travel Map of Israel and Jordan. There may be others, but I found this one. It actually has, against Damia, it has in brackets after it, Adama. So that map recognises the equivalence of these places. And just to show you where we're looking at, this is a somewhat simplified map of the region. So, right, here's the Mediterranean Sea. That is the River Jordan, Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea. There's Jericho. The Israelites had come up on the east side of the Dead Sea and were opposite Jericho. And here's Adam upstream. Ancient Adam, modern Damia. Oh, by the way, Damia can be spelt in different ways because people would write down words as they were pronounced. So Damia is sometimes spelt D-A-M-I-A and sometimes D-A-M-I-Y-A. And also D-A-M-I-Y-E-H as well, but they're all the same place. Well, can we prove that ancient Adam is modern Damia beyond reasonable doubt? Well, it turns out, and here's where the science comes in. You'll be waiting for the science. Here's where the science comes in. On July the 11th, 1927, there was a well-documented earthquake which shook Jericho. Buildings collapsed, walls cracked. You may be interested, the walls also collapsed. And this earthquake was detected in places as far apart as Europe, USA, and Russia on seismographs. This particular earthquake was 6.5 on the Richter scale, which, for comparison, the earthquake you may remember in Kobe in Japan in 1995, which killed 5,000 people, that was 7.2 on the Richter scale, and the earthquake in San Francisco, which partially collapsed the San Francisco Oakland Bridge, killed 62 people, that was 7.1 on the Richter scale. So this is not as high, not as strong as that earthquake, but nevertheless a substantial, significant earthquake. The earthquake arises because of slippage along what's known as the Jericho Fault, and this is a fault which runs north-south along the River Jordan, which is itself part of the Great Rift Valley. So there are two tectonic plates, I believe, and there are people in the audience, like my introducer Bob White, who know a lot more about this than myself. I understand there's a tectonic plate on one side of the Jordan, another tectonic plate on the other side, and these are moving relative to each other. And it's this slippage which has created the Great Rift Valley. And so this is what the earthquake originates from. And a number of people have studied this phenomenon, but this is one person, Professor Amos Neer, who is a well-known professor of geophysics at Stanford University, and he wrote to me. I wrote to him about this because I knew he was studying this particular earthquake. And he said, during the 1927 earthquake, and this is a direct quotation from his writing to me, during the 1927 earthquake, several ground tracts appeared, together with an outpouring of groundwater. The soil liquefaction phenomenon has been well observed in earthquakes elsewhere. During the earthquake, mudslides occurred along the Jordan near Damia, about 30 kilometres, that's, if you prefer, 18 miles, north of Jericho. These temporarily stopped the river's flow. So what he's saying is there was an earthquake, the earthquake gave rise to a mudslide, the mudslide occurred at Damia, just the place which we believe to be ancient Adam. And not only did this happen, but these mudslides temporarily stopped the river's flow. That occurred in 1927, and it's happened on other occasions as well. And his letter to me continues, Adam is now Damia, so he's certain of this. The site of the 1927 mudslides, which cut off the flow of the Jordan, such cut-offs, lasting typically 1 to 2 days, have also been recorded in 1906, 1834, 1546, 1534, 1267, and 1160. He goes on to say the stoppage of the Jordan is so typical of earthquakes in this region that little doubt can be left of the reality of such events in Joshua's time. And notice how long the river is typically cut off. It's 1 to 2 days. Basically, you have this mudslide across the river, and then the water piles up behind and either has to come over the top of the mudslide or go round it. And that typically takes 1 to 2 days. And I have a photograph here of a mudslide which almost stopped the Jordan, but didn't quite. This was taken in 1957, and here you see the mudslide, and the Jordan sort of flowed around it. So, if that had been a more substantial... So this mudslide was caused by an earthquake. If that had been more substantial, you can imagine it blocking the river. You may well notice here, when I first saw this photograph, I was impressed by this, but I questioned it because I thought, gosh, the river's not very wide. And if any of you have been to see the Jordan, as I have, the river is not a very wide river. And so, you think to yourself, why didn't the Israelites swim across? And we'll come to that in a moment. First of all, was the crossing a miracle? What we've said is there is a natural mechanism that science can propound and explain, and this is that an earthquake-induced mudslide happened, behind which the waters of the Jordan piled up, and then they could break through 1 or 2 days later. We've also said that linguistically we can identify Adam with Damia, and in more modern times, Damia is the place which these earthquake-induced mudslides have happened. So I think we can really say this is, to my mind, a consistent story. Now, the interesting point is that we can explain this by science, but the Old Testament is quite clear this is a major miracle of God. So can we, as it were, square these two viewpoints? And first, we need to ask how the ancient Israelites thought about events like this. And we have to place the ancient Israelites in the context of other ancient civilizations. And nearly every ancient civilization, as we know, had many gods. The Babylonians did, the Egyptians did. So as I put here, the Egyptians had one god to control the rain, another controlled the annual flooding of the Nile, another Egyptian god controlled the rising of the sun, another god the rising of the moon, and so on. Ancient Israel had one god who, as it were, encompassed all of these. Their God controlled all the forces of nature, not just the individual ones. And so to the Israelites, I believe, if an earthquake caused the Jordan to stop, they regard this as just as much the hand of God as if he clicked his fingers or sent an angel, because God was in charge of the natural world, they believed. What was the miracle, and what revealed it to them as the hand of God, was that this happened at just the right time. So just as the Israelites were there on the water's edge, needing to cross to get to the promised land, this miracle happened. If you doubt that explanation, I'll read you again. I'm watching my watch carefully. This is a passage from the Old Testament book of Psalms. It's part of Psalm 77, and I think it's quite a remarkable passage. It says, "You are the God who performs miracles." So, the writer's introducing this, saying, I'm going to talk about miracles. "You display your power among the peoples. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world." So here the psalmist is saying, thunder and lightning, they're your thunder, they're your lightning. You're in charge, you're the God. "The earth trembled and quaked." So here's the earthquake coming in. "Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." So he's clearly referring back to the Exodus, because he talks about Moses and Aaron, and talks about these natural events being the handiwork of God. And he adds this wonderful phrase, "though your footprints were not seen." In other words, God didn't come down and leave his footprints in the mud. He didn't come down and leave behind a celestial visiting card saying, God was here. He did these subtle acts through nature. And the Israelites saw them as the handiwork of God. Here's another example of a miracle we won't be able to consider because of lack of time. This is a crossing of the Red Sea. And the book of Exodus says, "Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land." So the Bible is explicit that there was a natural mechanism for this miracle. There was a strong east wind. I put "consider later." We will not consider it later because there's not time. But again, we've got another remarkable miracle of timing. The Jordan stopped just when the Israelites were gathered on the bank. The Red Sea was driven back just when the Israelites were trapped there by Pharaoh's army. So let's try and picture the scene again. And as I said, the River Jordan now is not too impressive, but the fact is that since 1940, large quantities of water have been taken both by Israel and by Jordan on either side for irrigation, and so the Jordan is a shadow of its former self. The Old Testament book of Joshua says the Israelites crossed in the spring. They said the 10th day of the first month, and that corresponds roughly to March and April in our calendar. The source of the Jordan, we know, is largely the snow-capped Mount Hermon. There are a few other sources. And what happens is the snow melts in the spring and the river floods. So when the book of Joshua says that the river was in flood, this is consistent with it being the spring, which it also tells us. And there was a British expedition to the Jordan in the 19th century before this water had been removed for irrigation purposes, and they found the Jordan in flood was half a mile wide. Right? So what we see now as a River Jordan is quite different from how it existed then. In flood, half a mile wide. So that was the river. It was a real barrier to them, the river they crossed. And I suggest that after 3,000 years, we actually know how and why and where the crossing occurred. And this is a rather rare photograph taken in the 19th century of the River Jordan in flood. And you can see, you can just see what it looks like. I mean, these trees and bushes normally have their roots, in dry soil. And here the Jordan's in flood and flooding over this side and flooding over that side. So it was a huge barrier for them to cross. And this was the river that was stopped. Just let me say a few more words about miracles of timing. Let me try and use the language of Aristotle, who was a wise old man. And Aristotle thought about miracles. And he had two phrases he used. He used the phrase, the efficient cause and the final cause. So in the language of Aristotle, the efficient cause, we're saying, is a natural agent. In the case of water from a rock, it's the porous rocks storing water and Moses breaking the crust with his staff. In the case of the crossing of the Jordan, it's an earthquake-induced landslide which stops the flow of the Jordan. So that's the official cause, a natural agent. But the final cause is the will of God. How do you know it's a miracle? By the extraordinary timing of the event. That's how the miracle is revealed. And what we're saying is that if you're a believer in God, then you believe that God worked in, with and through nature to perform this miracle of crossing the Jordan. There are many miracles like this, which I believe have scientific mechanisms in the whole Exodus story. There's the burning bush, there's all 10 of the plagues, the pillars of cloud and fire, crossing the Red Sea, turning bitter water sweet, water from a rock, crossing the Jordan. I think all of them, possibly or probably, all of them probably have explanations that modern science can give. And I give these in my book, in fact, or I try to give them. So I believe no scientific laws are broken here. Any event taken individually, I believe, could be lucky chance, because lucky chance events certainly happen. But what happens here is you have event after event after event which happens just at the right time. And I do think that suggests a final cause. I'll give you a trivial explanation. About a year ago, I noticed after having a shower, about 3 hours later, shower in the bathroom upstairs, about 3 hours later, there was a wet patch on the kitchen ceiling. And I thought, that's chance. I thought, if I have a shower and there's some sort of leak, the patch will occur in about 15 minutes. It won't be 3 hours later. So I thought that's just chance, and I just dismissed it. And the patch went away, so I forgot about it until I had another shower. And then a few hours later, another wet patch. And I still thought, this is really unlikely. It's going to take 3 hours for the water to come through. But when it happened a third time, I knew it wasn't chance. I knew there was a causal relationship. And indeed there was, and we found the water leak. And it was a tortuous path. That's why it took 3 hours to come through. So I think it is with the miracles of Exodus. I've given a quotation from Richard Dawkins. This is a quotation I very much like from a wise old, he's now died recently, but a wise Dutch scientist, Professor Huygens, in his book Religion and the Rise of Modern Science, he says, the scientist, even when he is a believer, is bound to try as far as possible to reduce miracles to regularities. And I believe that's right. I believe miracles, ancient or modern, you should first investigate with all the rigours of science. The believer, even when he is a scientist, discovers miracles in the most familiar things. Well, what about if you can't reduce miracles to regularities? So let me move on to the resurrection. And the key question to ask, of course, is, can science explain the resurrection? And I think it's clear that it cannot with our present knowledge. And I suspect it probably never will. Now, we should be very careful about saying that because, of course, science today is so much more powerful than science was 100 years ago. So who knows in 100 years' time? But even so, the resurrection seems to break, as it were, so many of rather fundamental physical laws that's my guess that it probably never will be capable of being explained by science. So it really looks to me, and I may be wrong, that in the resurrection, natural laws are being broken. And what is, I think, an interesting point to make is that this gives scientists a problem, but it also gives theologians a problem. And the reason it gives theologians a problem is that the whole picture of God you get from the Bible is a consistent God. All sorts of passages I could quote, but I won't. The consistency of God comes through. So theologically, if you believe God created the universe and is upholding it and is a consistent God, then would God break, as it were, the laws he has established? So, in a sense, in a real sense, there's a theological problem as well as a scientific problem. Let me give you an analogy, which I quite like, but of course you can't push analogies too far. The music analogy. If you're standing behind a pianist and you watch the pianist's fingers, and every time the pianist goes to play the note F, he plays F sharp, you can deduce, if you keep watching, the key signature of the music. And the key signature of the music is the rules the composer has established for playing that piece of music. If you keep watching, you may observe that on occasion, when he should play F sharp, he plays F. Or he may play black notes when normally he should be playing the white notes. And these are what musicians call accidentals. And the composer has put them in the music. And the composer, of course, is free to put them in the music. He is the composer. Although he's set up a key signature, which is the way the music should normally be played, he is free to say, on occasion, it should be played differently. If he is a great composer, it should make better music for the accidentals to be there. And I have tried this, and you can try this. Go home, take out a piece of great music, and play it without the accidentals. And you will find it sounds much worse. Now, it's a hard experiment because we're familiar with the music with the accidentals, so I know that. But nevertheless, it's the accidentals which contribute to making a piece of music great, in my opinion. Well, the analogy with God, if you believe in a God, is clear that God has created the universe and upholds the universe and is a consistent God, but he is free to break his rules. But if he's a consistent God, it must make more sense than less sense. It must be more consistent for him to break his rules than less consistent. And if you look at how the Bible regards the resurrection, here's Peter speaking at Pentecost just 7 weeks after the crucifixion. He says, "But God raised him from the dead," that's Jesus, "because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him." So what Peter's saying is, if Jesus really was the Son of God, and that's the key thing, then the resurrection was inevitable and not incredible. So the resurrection is more consistent to happen if Jesus was the Son of God than for Jesus to remain dead. So I think that's the way I like to look at the resurrection. Let me give a final thought on Feynman. I'm not sure if this is relevant or not, but let me give it anyway. Feynman talks about the rhythms and patterns of nature we call physical laws. And these physical laws provide the framework for how the universe operates. Kepler once said scientists are trying to think God's thoughts after him. So we look at these regularities in the universe, we find out about them, we formulate physical laws. It seems to me that within this framework of regularities, there are very rare irregularities. One thing I do is to work with crystals, and crystals have defects in them. In fact, people are rather like, let's get it right, people are rather like crystals. It's the defects in them which tend to make them interesting. Now, so crystals usually have a huge range of defects. You can grow silicon, if you're very careful, with no dislocations in at all, no stacking faults in at all. You're then left with just a perfect periodic array of atoms, except at room temperature, there is one vacancy in every 10 to the 12 atoms, right? Every million atoms. Extremely hard to detect. It's there for thermodynamic reasons, of course, because the vacancy actually increases the internal energy of the crystal, but the entropy also goes up and the free energy just goes down a little. But here we have this regular periodic array of atoms, almost perfectly regular, but there's one vacancy every 10 to 12 atoms. If you look at DNA, repeats regularly, except there are defects in it. There are mutations, and my understanding here is very weak, but my understanding is the mutations give rise to the rich variety of life that we have. So I suspect these sorts of rare irregularities probably occur in science everywhere you look. I don't know that. I suspect it would be an interesting thing to investigate. So this rhythms and patterns of the universe, I suspect, is not quite as regular as the Feynman statement implies. And it may be that these rare irregularities in the universe are critical in some ways. So I put that out as a passing thought. But now let's just return to, can scientists believe in miracles? Part one is for miracles like the resurrection, which appear to me to be rather like accidentals on a music score. Looked at it, if you like, more mathematically, you can regard this, a miracle, as a singularity in space and time, in which locally in space and time the laws are locally different. And outside this singularity, the scientific laws are unchanged. So mathematically, I think you can think of having a contour around this isolated singularity, outside of which the laws are unchanged. And so I think the scientists who are religious can believe in such miracles without compromising their science. This is a local irregularity, let's not say irregularity, a local singularity in which God chooses to operate the laws of nature differently at that point in space and time. That applies, I think, to a few miracles. Most miracles, I believe, are miracles of timing in which no scientific laws are broken, and therefore they shouldn't be a problem for scientists to believe in. So to answer the question, can scientists believe in miracles? I suggest the answer is yes. Right, thank you.